Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Mark Twain House Museum's Trouble Begins series. As always, I'm Jody DeBrine. I'm the Director of Collections at the Mark Twain House Museum, and it is my pleasure to be your host for this evening. I first want to do a little bit of business before we get started. As always, we want to thank our sponsors, the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira, New York. They generously support this program and help us make it happen. If you want to help support this program and make it happen, I know some of you have already donated, but there is a green "Your support is vital to the Mark Twain House Museum" button down at the bottom of your screen. If you click that, every dollar helps us keep this program going and other programs here at the Mark Twain House. Many of you have already found it, but onto the side of your screen, there is a chat feature. Feel free to go ahead and chat amongst yourselves during the program. But if you have a question, please use the Ask a Question feature. It's down near the bottom of your screen. Also down there, I will be putting up a few polls throughout our program for you to kind of interact with. So go ahead. I'll put notes and indicate when those polls go up and give us your feedback so that when we get to the Ask a Question feature, we'll talk about those a little bit more. And since most of you are Twainiacs in the audience and things like that, before we move on to tonight's program, I do want to draw your attention to some of the great programs that we have upcoming for the Christmas season. We have 4 wonderful Clemens conversations based on Christmas that will be happening throughout the next few weeks up until the Christmas season. So I put the link to those in the chat. Feel free to register for those after you're done with tonight's Trouble Begins. I am so pleased to welcome Giacomo Calabria to the Trouble Begins series. He is an award-winning educator, essayist, novelist. As a writer, he strives to present scholarly research in a more accessible manner. And he's also an educator and has taught classes on various aspects of history and literature and the arts since 2006. Tonight, we are going to talk about Mark Twain and games, specifically video games. So I'm going to bring you back on screen if you're ready. Here we go. So super excited for this. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm basically gonna turn it over to you and your PowerPoint and slideshow and everything. And everybody in the audience just be amazed, be wowed. Like, this is such a cool program. We went through the tech run on Monday, and I'm so excited for everybody to see this. So all yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Of course, thank you to everyone at the museum, and thank all of you who are here right now. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Giacomo Calabria. I am a lecturer with Humanities New York, a public scholar with them, and I am also a writer under the pen name Jacopo della Quercia, which I've been using throughout my entire writing career. So when it comes to today's discussion, first thing I do want to do is express my thanks to, again, the museum for everything that you've been doing, not only with Troubles Begins, but also when it comes to everything that you have been offering and continue to offer during this very, very uncertain past year and a half. So I have been following your museum online. Glad to hear that everyone is well over there. And as someone who, my wife is from outside of Connecticut, I am particularly glad to hear that the museum has still been operational for as long as it has been. So thank you very much for all of your work, and thank you to everyone who has donated or volunteered or simply attended in order to keep it operational. So when it comes to today's conversation, let's get straight to the troublemaking. And just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will be going through them at the Q&A session at the end of our discussion. Okay. My screen share is on. Everyone should be able to see and hear what's coming on as we have our discussion on Mark Twain Gamer.
Your screen share disconnected, so try it again.
Oh, how troublesome.
It was up for just a second and then it went away. So
let's try this again. There we are. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
All right. Let's continue. All right. I'm going to hide this. Everything good now? Are we good?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, moving on. So the trouble begins. Now, I do want to make it very clear when it comes to this subject, this was something that I actually wasn't planning on dedicating research or even receiving an invitation to discuss this, because I was as surprised as you when it came to my recent research and understanding of Mark Twain's contributions to gaming, both in terms of table gaming and also video games in general. But I will say, though, the main reason why I am here, the seed that planted my interest and what eventually led me into pop culture studies recently, and also when it comes to Mark Twain's contributions to the same, begins about a little over a decade ago when it came to a comment that the late Roger Ebert made when it came to video games as an art form. So a little over 10 years ago, Roger Ebert made a lot of news. If you remember, he was actually quite prominent on Twitter when he was still alive. And he made a comment about how video games are not art. And not only that, that video games can never be considered art. Naturally, this was something that was met with a whole lot of criticism. Many gamers, some of them just dismissing him as being old or out of touch. Other gamers, though, did say that there are excellent games that he probably hasn't heard of. Shadows of Colossus was frequently mentioned, and several others were offered to him for playing. And Roger Ebert eventually backed away his criticism a little bit after acknowledging that he hadn't played that many recent video games, but he nevertheless reinforced his initial criticism, which is that on principle, video games cannot be considered art. Now, where does Mark Twain come into this? Well, when one of the critics was saying that Mark Twain actually dedicated about a year of his life when he was working on Huckleberry Finn to actually building a game, and which eventually became patented, Roger Ebert decided to think, well, first of all, Roger Ebert was proposed with the possibility of how if Mark Twain were alive today, there's a chance that he might have actually gone into video game design, specifically video game writing. Not only that, it's possible that that could have been his dominant art form, with literature and lecturing on the side being more accessories to his main moneymaker, so to speak. Which, now I want to make it very clear, when it comes to Mark Twain and video games, I honestly think he would be skeptical, especially if he was already an established writer, when it comes to investing time or money into video games, until someone told him that he could make money doing it. That's the game changer when it comes to Sam Clemens. So specifically, let's just see this, before the internet, before Nintendo, before any of these, Mark Twain did briefly dip his toes into game design. But I do want to quickly say that, in my opinion, one of the most troublesome questions when it comes to whether or not video games are an art is what Roger Ebert did. He actually had a completely unscientific poll where he asked people on Twitter and on his website, specifically, what would you value more, a great video game or Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain? By an almost 2-to-1 margin, people selected a great video game over Huckleberry Finn. And ultimately, I personally think that shaped the subsequent essay that Roger Ebert planned on offering when it came to his opinions on the subject. But that said, let's forget about this poll for a minute and let's get straight to the most interesting aspect of this. Mark Twain, game designer. And here it is. What you see here is the Mark Twain Memory Builder, patented in 1885, designed by Sam Clemens himself. Now, specifically when it comes to its origin, I wasn't able to find 100% conclusive evidence on this, but it looks like it is pretty sound that what Mark Twain did was he attended a lecture that was on the method of Loki, using the Latin pronunciation, because I personally think that with the MCU and the Loki series, Loki is going to be easier for you to remember, which is also known as a memory palace. A memory palace is when you use objects around you, such as in a room or in a study, and you sort of, how do I put it? You sort of use them as a way of remembering something that might be very complex. So one example is I have a blank piece of paper over here. If I were to say, use this piece of paper as something that in my mind triggers, I don't know, a passage from the Confessions of St. Augustine, I would get this piece of paper, put it somewhere where I could find it, and then basically put it out of my mind until I see it again. I know this sounds very far-fetched, but it has been practiced for millennia. And I can say I have personally, out of just curiosity, entertained it when I was working on my first novel, which you can see over my right shoulder. The method does work. In my personal experience, though, it drives you nuts because all of a sudden, you can't throw out this piece of paper anymore because that's the Gutenberg Bible. And you can't get rid of, this stray paper cup because, I don't know, that's Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, which actually probably does belong in the garbage. But that's a subject for a different discussion. When it comes to the game that Mark Twain designed, it actually started off as a yard activity. What he did was he came up with a method of using the garden around his house and actually using markers throughout them as a way of trying to teach his daughters English history, specifically the very troublesome series of years and dates and monarchs, which I can even say, as a student and as a scholar on the subject, can be overwhelming for students of any background. So the idea was walking through the garden, which would be carefully marked, each step would represent a year. And if you actually had posts for each of the monarchs, such as William the Conqueror over here is William I, and then William II over here, you can actually see based on the distances between them, what was a long reign, what was a short reign. So for example, if you were, say, going to Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth II, there would be an enormous pass between the most recent monarch and the one that you were looking for. That's the kind of visual memorization that Mark Twain was very interested in using as a way of remembering these names and dates and associating something with them, which can be as instantly recognizable as simply looking at a garden. What he did was he got that method, and rather than having it as a yard activity, essentially translated it into this sort of punch hole. I believe it was inspired by cribbage, which uses a similar board when it comes to marking points, essentially the scatter plot as a way of not only playing the game, but also keeping score. And to make it a little bit more interesting, put some colors in here. I guess we could call these the limited edition ones that you might see in Parade magazine for an inflated price. And that is Mark Twain's contribution to table gaming. And it was terrible. It was boring. It was the kind of thing that is very heartbreaking when it comes to Mark Twain, the investor. I don't know if this was something that was one of many gigantic failures for him financially. If the museum knows, please interrupt me right now. But this was definitely something that he did invest time into. It was something that he was taking time away from working on Huckleberry Finn to deliver. And ultimately, this being his first foray into the subject was without a doubt a failure. Nobody plays this today. 100 years later, actually pretty close to the date. So as I mentioned, this game by Mark Twain was patented in 1885. Fast forward 100 years to 1985.
What will the future bring from Nintendo? More hits like The Legend of Zelda.
So 100 years later, we have the Nintendo Entertainment System essentially resurrecting the entire video game industry from the video game crash of 1983. And it's going to be several years after this, in the year 1989, where we see not only one, but two Mark Twain-themed video games coming out in the same year for the Nintendo Entertainment System. We'll be discussing them right now. And they are The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Seta and Square's Tom Sawyer. And Square, for those of you who are gamers, yes, this is the same Square as Squaresoft, the designers behind the Final Fantasy series, Earthbound, all those classics, some of the most famous JRPGs in history. They made a Tom Sawyer game. And I guess I'll say probably the only thing clever about it is the little since 1855 up here. I'm going to go into some of the unfortunate aspects of these games in a little bit. So the first one, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, released on February 6, 1989 in Japan and shortly after in the United States. It's worth mentioning that even now it is unusual not only to have two video games like this made by completely independent companies, but to actually have them come out on the same system. It's very counterintuitive because it's going to dilute the market where I'm going to be honest, there wasn't really that much of a demand for Tom Sawyer during this time period. There wasn't, just to put in perspective, there wasn't like an Oscar-winning film that had just come out when it came to Tom Sawyer. When it comes to the popularity of Twain's works, Huckleberry Finn, of course, much more popular. And keep in mind, they had the entire library of Mark Twain works to choose from. They could have made a video game on a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which I think would make an awesome video game. It's a fish out of water kind of story. There's time travel involved. It's swords and shields and everything like that. They easily could have made a Legend of Zelda-esque overhead adventure game with that. For whatever reason, two companies for Nintendo decided to make a Tom Sawyer game, this first one being what's called a platformer. A platformer, which I'm showing an example of from the time period, this is the original Super Mario Brothers, is essentially a video game where you are controlling a character or characters and bring them onto what are called platforms. A platform is simply an area on the screen that you can physically go onto and use that as a way of going to another location. Again, you're just changing levels. You're going from one platform to another, which is how the Adventures of Tom Sawyer is. One of the benefits when it comes to video game studies is these entire games, full playthroughs of these games are available online. And not only that, what I find particularly interesting as a researcher is we have a plethora of comments and commentaries on these video games. So for those of you who might be sociologists, some of you who are interested in pursuing popular culture studies, I can tell you as someone who has lectured twice at the Northeastern Pop Culture Association that there is a large and rapidly growing interest in video game studies and also in contributing additional writing to the subject of the same. So when it comes to this video game, as I said, please, if any of you are interested in this, go online, read the comments, go to the message boards, just look at the plethora of information we have on some of these otherwise obscure video games. So the Adventures of Tom Sawyer, I can tell you right now, is a broken game. This image that we're seeing over here, it's supposed to be a pirate ship. This is actually the fourth level in the game in the Japanese release, and thus is meant to be the fourth level. It starts off with it in the United States due to an error in programming, which is a very poor decision because this is a much harder level in a video game. Usually in video games, levels, boss battles, challenges, these are all designed to teach a gamer certain memorization methods or how to use certain objects in the video game as a way of graduating past each level to its completion. So this game, from the very beginning, I can tell you, is what's called a broken game. This is a major error in how it was designed. And furthermore, by taking not only this action approach, but as you can see, as with many video games during the time period, having Tom Sawyer being attacked by a barrage of pirates and giant rats. Eventually, he fights a gigantic octopus. I saw one comment on this YouTube playthrough. No one remembered the part in Tom Sawyer where Tom fought this titanic octopus. I'll be honest, that would have been pretty cool if that did happen in the book, or if Sam Clemens had an alternate version of the story where all of a sudden on the Mississippi, this gigantic gator, I don't know, the size of the Chrysler building showed up, and they had to duel it with, I think these are actually supposed to be rocks that he's shooting at the gator with a slingshot. So as I mentioned, this video game, which I will say, these large boss battles that they have over here, these sprites are actually quite impressive for the time period. When it came to video games that did have very large enemies such as these in the Nintendo Entertainment System, it was in a way showcasing some of the graphic potential of the NES when it came to this. But I can tell you right now, fighting this demon over here that looks like something out of like a PG version of Castlevania, trying to take out this huge zeppelin over here. It's fighting that giant octopus. This is extremely loosely based on the source material. It isn't really anything that I would consider educational unless you are approaching it when it comes to video game design. So this is not a very good game, poorly designed and executed, and it arrived with serious bugs. Now, when it comes to Square's Tom Sawyer, this is a whole different story, and it's one that is a much more unfortunate story. So this one was released on March 19th, 1989. Again, on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Big differences, this one was released only in Japan. And specifically, it is what's known as a JRPG, which means a Japanese role-playing game. Now, many role-playing games that you might be familiar with, especially during this time period, the most famous being Gary Gygax's Dungeons and Dragons. When it comes to Japanese RPGs, these were different in the sense that these were video games that used lots of playable characters that you could change their name of, and you would, say, move them around a town and have them interact with different situations and characters. In a way, it's actually a very long script that, based on the characters that you chose, you would have a way of controlling the script, and the script would determine the story you would be playing, which usually would be pretty strictly divided to follow a main narrative, but did offer the opportunity for branching storylines. And when it comes to the controversy of this game, and again, it breaks my heart to be sharing this because mechanically, historically, this is actually not a bad video game. When it comes to its portrayal of Jim, on the other hand, it is heartbreakingly, painfully racist. So for this, I'm actually going to turn on the sound a little bit. I want you to see what would happen if you booted this game. And the trouble begins. That's Huck Finn over there. So what you're seeing here is a very typical example, and actually a very good example, of a JRPG in the 8-bit era. The 8-bit era referring to the primarily Nintendo Entertainment System basis of video games. You would have an introduction where you would have an understanding of who your 3 or 4 main characters would be. You would have this video that's known as a cutscene playing in front of you, and they would use this as a way of establishing the situation that you're usually being thrown into. And it would usually require the player to physically move around and interact with people to learn. Again, it breaks my heart seeing this right now. According to IGN.com, they did a list of the most racist video games in history, and for the reasons you can plainly see, and it does unfortunately get a little bit worse. This is considered by IGN the 4th most racist video game. In terms of its overall history, I can say that this game is mostly famous for its racism, which is worth mentioning was endemic when it came to many games that came out of Japan during the time. And I have found interviews with the designers themselves, and they do say apologetically that there wasn't much more of a cultural sensitivity when it came to designing many of these games, and when it came not only to portrayals of African Americans or really African South Pacific Islanders in general, there was also very racist treatment when it came to not only Native Americans but South Asians and etc. It's the kind of thing where if you look at, say, familiar games such as Street Fighter 2, or if you look at some of the less glamorous...
So I'm going to interrupt you for just a second and say that the music seems to be getting louder.
All right.
And you seem to be getting quieter. So
thank you very much. Yeah, long story short, yeah, this is not the best era when it comes to very culturally sensitive video games. This game that you see over here is one of the crowning examples of it, from one of the most, if not the most famous designers of Japanese RPGs. I do want to quickly say over here that there are interesting aspects that they're executing over here that actually a work of literature, including one as rich with characters as a Mark Twain work, it actually works quite well. For one of them is with Mark Twain, we have a large cast of characters, people that we learn about in the book, and as a result, we have an understanding of what they might look like, things they might say, random things if you bump into them. And not only that, when it comes to some of the famous examples of moments where Tom Sawyer graduates as a character, so to speak, such as whitewashing in Polly's Fence, that's the kind of thing that works very well for a video game, because you would have to physically get these items, which could be a brush and a bucket of paint. You have to go to a certain location, specifically the fence, and using those items together, you have to figure out what to do. These are the kind of choose your own adventure-esque decisions that determine a video game that is a JRPG. And just to give you an idea, using in Polly's Fence, basically the game would require you to get some help when it comes to whitewashing the fence. It would encourage you to say, do you want to do this by yourself? There's some kids over there. Do you want to talk to them? These are where, if we were simply making a game like this from scratch, that it would actually be beneficial to follow some of these standards that are typical in JRPGs. And furthermore, something else that there's a lot of in JRPGs is adventuring. So this is where you can see right now, not only walking around a town, but let me jump forward a little bit in the game. This is very common in JRPGs, walking through a forest, or even going onto a river raft and going down water, or going into the climax of the game when they're going through a cave. It's not simply, what you're seeing right now is not simply them doing a rather faithful approach to the different locations in the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. These are actually very typical in Squaresoft games in general. Probably the most famous example off the top of my head is Final Fantasy VI. In Final Fantasy VI, we have very famous examples repeatedly where they're going through caves, almost no differently than this, than when they're going on a river raft, not too differently than when he's on a raft earlier in the game. And when it comes to the design that they have over here, what you see right now is speechlessly in a way that pretty much anyone in the world can very quickly recognize is a Tom Sawyer simulator. That goes on for quite a while. There's a lot of rowing in that video game. So moving forward about 20 years into the future, there's one last video game that I've selected for discussion. I do want to make it clear that this lecture is not exhaustive. There are other video games and other different types of Mark Twain influenced games, such as board games, that could be a subject of further discussion, or that I know the museum is more familiar with than I am. But for the subject of tonight's discussion, I do want us to touch upon this video game over here, because it is more recent, and it also shows, in my opinion, one of the more educational approaches that is available to game design today when it comes to adapting Mark Twain's work, which is not simply faithfully adapting the book or the material, but also using it as an opportunity to talk about Mark Twain, the person. What you see over here is Midnight Mystery 3, Devil on the Mississippi. Quick question, if anybody who's attending this talk has played this video game, please let us know in the chat. I'm genuinely curious. This is the Mark Twain House offering. Please, we want to know if the people who are regulars for these Mark Twain events have played this game. I'm genuinely curious. This was released on May 26, 2011 by the game designer company Mumbo Jumbo. Its category is it's a casual game. Casual games are usually the kind of games where there's no ticking clock. There's usually no way that you can die in the game. And it's the kind of thing that might be used as in a way of passing the time, such as Sudoku. You can't really die if you're playing Sudoku, unless you actually do die in real life. But that's a subject for a different class. It's also known as a point-and-click adventure game, meaning that it's going to be following a story that does have somewhat a grand goal to it, in this case, the fate of Mark Twain's soul. And there's going to be many different images that are hidden on the screen that you have to find and click. And for this, going to once again show a quick clip of what this game is like. Again, this being a recent game, it has probably, well, not probably, it has the best graphics out of all of them. Again, what we're seeing is called a cutscene. This is designed to establish the A plot in the story, so to speak, the reason why you are playing this video game in the terms of the action that you'll be taking later on. We see very early on, this is a ghost story. And there he is. The report of my death has been greatly exaggerated. Excuse me, museum, quick question. What is the actual quote that Mark Twain said when it came to
Oh,
that?
let me get the actual quote up. Hold on one second so I don't
Interrupt me when you get it. Just
Okay.
I am curious because I know it's brilliant commentary, and I am curious if they got it correct. Be a good way of seeing if they did the research. So the moment you have it, interrupt me. Now, looking at this image right over here, as I said, this is what's called a hidden object game. Now, simply look in the background, and for those of you who know Mark Twain, you might recognize a few objects in there. There's a catfish up on the wall. There's a banjo down there. Anyone, please start commenting in the chat section. Let us know if you can see which book or which aspect of Sam Clemens' life that they are referencing with these images over here. And specifically, when it comes to the first object in the game, Twain was saying that he was thirsty and he wants something warm. So you just pick up a teacup, pick up some tea, and you offer him some tea. It's a way of simply explaining to the gamer the mechanics of the game. Specifically, this is the type of game where you are going to be directed to find objects no differently than an I Spy or puzzle. And
I have the quote for you.
Oh, you have it?
Yeah. So it says, "The report of my illness grew out of his illness. The report of my death was an exaggeration."
Excellent. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And I have a quick question. Since you probably know better than any of us, just looking at all these images that are bombarding us, which of these are sticking out to you as referential to Mark Twain's life or to Mark Twain's writing?
I mean, I think a lot of them. I mean, I just saw the Halley's Comet poster or something pop up, which of course he came and went, born under and died under. I don't see it here, but when we were looking at this earlier, there was a cat around, which of course we all know he loves cats. Missouri just popped up, which is where he was born. And I mean, I think it's there's so many little hidden gems in here. I will say also, I told this to Giacomo earlier, the museum owns this in our collection. We have a copy of this, and I'm 100% going to go put it into my CD player on Friday when I'm back in the office and play this game.
So now I am very curious, just to start things off. Mark Twain, when he came to his memory game, it was meant to be an educational game, something to help his daughters and help people in general remember very esoteric names and dates in English history. When it comes to what we're seeing right now, in your opinion, what are some of the potential educational merits or benefits when it comes to a game like this?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, just a way to get people engaged with different parts of Mark Twain's life. I mean, he's such an interesting man, and to click on each of these things. I mean, we do basically the same thing during our virtual tour. You can go onto our website and go into the house and click on a yellow dot and learn more about it. So, I mean, this is just that, there's so many ways to layer different elements of his story, not only his writing, but his own personal life into this. And, verified quotes.
Excellent. So now I have a quick question, if you don't mind being put on the spot.
No,
So you've never played this game, correct?
I have not, no.
All right, I'm just going to jump to like one or two different images over here. And if you could, in order to illustrate how an understanding of Mark Twain could ease in the gameplay, could you just let us know a few objects that might stick out to you as this is referential to this, or that this is important, the player should click on that? So like this image over here, which in this image sticks out to you as something that a player should click on if they're playing this game?
It's a little fuzzy, so I'm trying to make some of it out, and I'm probably the least qualified Mark Twain employee to do this. Let's see what's here. Well, we have a pickaxe laying on one of the crates there, and he did the mining for and there. Let's see. We have, it looks like a uniform there, and we know that he spent like 14 days in the Army. Missouri just popped up, which of course is where he lived and was born. I'm not sure what else I'm seeing. So
I'm going to jump to another. I appreciate everything that you mentioned over there. Let me just jump to another one. So over here, anything in particular stick out to you?
So we have Shakespeare, looks like, in the back in a portrait, and we know that Shakespeare was an influence. And
But look at the portrait again. Now, who is it?
Oh, no, I'm not sure who it is.
Christopher Marlowe.
It's changing.
And what do we have over here?
Cool.
Let's go back. I want to pause that for a moment. So they're going very lost.
Yeah, going quickly.
Yeah, they're going very. Yeah, they were going very quickly there. But let me just quickly see what. Let me go back. I'm losing my place. All right, last time we're doing this, I promise. And don't worry, I'm not going to be mentioning. All right, this is what I was looking for. All right, so let's quickly see what they. All right, so we got Tom Sawyer Detective.
That was another one of his books. Yeah.
Excellent.
Lesser known, but definitely there.
All right, I want them to open that box or the steamer trunk. All right, so we're going a little quickly over here. This is what's called a speed run, basically. They're playing the game as quickly as possible. We have over here The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe. Of course, a great subject of Mark Twain when it came to the Shakespeare authorship question. Unfortunately, Mark Twain was quite wrong. I believe it's been recently accepted by, Oxford University that Christopher Marlowe could be considered a co-writer of William Shakespeare's first 3 Henry plays. It was not, and basically Christopher Marlowe was not William Shakespeare. They were separate individuals who likely worked together for Shakespeare's first works. So little details like that. I think there was also like a badge with the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
Yep. Yeah. So we put that in the comment section. Aaron also asked, do you know who was on the Wanted poster?
Yes, I do. Injun Joe. And for whatever reason, Injun Joe is constantly appearing in all these video games. He's actually, it was Injun Joe from Tom Sawyer in the first one. Let me go back for a moment. I want to quickly get this game right over here. Again, another unfortunate racist aspect when it comes to his portrayal in games, but this is what they all went with. He's the end boss in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And when it comes to, for some reason, he's riding a dinosaur, or brachiosaurus. And when it comes to Square's Adventures of Tom Sawyer, I believe he's also the end boss for that one. Let me jump ahead. Let's see. There it is. So, an unfortunate aspect that of American literature that has not aged well. And I will say this is one thing that would be a challenge for game designers today, as mentioned when it came to the most recent game that only came out about 10 years ago. And over there, it is a delicate question creatively when it comes to being faithful to the material while also not being disrespectful to the racist then and now caricatures that they might be. But I will say that there is one interesting aspect. I just wanted to say this because I forgot about it when it comes to this video game. And that is, so terrible whenever Jim gets hit. It's actually somewhat similar to Pokemon in how they do battle. You battle many different characters and even animals in some cases throughout this game. And we always see them in the far distance. And if you can picture it, what we're seeing is basically a battle. It's like a gang fight. Everyone's putting up their fists and you're using items and throwing things that you can at them. And then whenever the opponent is going to be attacking you, they come in close and we see a larger portrait of them as illustrated right over here. So that's the very long, probably more than you were asking for answer of who's on that Wanted poster. And let's see, any other questions before we move on from this final video game?
Nope, I think that was it, at least at the moment.
All right, well, as I mentioned, when it came to, all right, this is the kind of thing where they're doing research that makes for a good video game. Having the ghost of Nikola Tesla in there, like basically the Jedi Master-esque Force ghost of him. Fantastic.
That's awesome.
This is a weird video game. There's a lot of missed opportunities they could have done. But it is nice to see that they not only did their research in quite a lot of areas, but they were able to find the parts of Mark Twain that are cool they were able to make that cool. So that's a very encouraging aspect of this. So in retrospect, looking at everything we discussed, we looked at the Mark Twain Memory Builder from 1885, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer for the Nintendo Entertainment System, Square's Tom Sawyer from the same year, also on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and Midnight Mystery 3, Devil on the Mississippi, 2011. Now, with that said, none of these games are considered great contributions to gaming. In fact, as I mentioned, as unfortunate as this is, probably the most famous out of all of these is Square's Tom Sawyer, simply because of the later celebrity that Square would be gaining in their pioneering work when it comes to the JRPG genre. So this does raise a question, why are there no great Mark Twain games? When you consider how Mark Twain has probably gifted us one of the greatest casts of characters in the history of American literature. It's one of the great measures that I've actually heard William Shakespeare measured by, how in the English-speaking world, William Shakespeare probably gave us the greatest cast of characters from his entire life's work. And when it comes to American literature, case could be made that Mark Twain probably is our Shakespeare in that regard. And when it comes to these characters, and when it comes to the fact that the mechanics of video games very oftentimes reward good narratives and stories like that, it seems that Mark Twain's material should be patered for making good video games. And not only that, but games in general. I just want to quickly illustrate some of the lost opportunities, even in Mark Twain's own time. Now, I want to make it clear, Mark Twain lived in essentially the golden age of table games. We usually say today is the golden age of board games, but keep in mind, this was at a time where he was playing chess. We know he played billiards. Some people consider billiards to be a table game. The game of life had been around since the American Civil War. So it wasn't impossible for him to see certain mechanics when it comes to table games that are useful. And when you see over here, this original, the garden approach that he was using, physically playing his memorization game, all he had to do was get his sketch and turn it into a board. What we're looking at could easily be a board game today. And even when it comes to using something such as a spreadsheet, we still use this with quite a few games today. How many of you have played Scattergories? Or how many of you have played Clue? In a way, they're just simply making something that's not too dissimilar from doing your taxes entertaining. Although I will make it very clear, Mark Twain's Memory Builder is much more like doing your taxes when it comes to fun factor. And even when it comes to the Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Square's Tom Sawyer, as I was saying before, one of the, well, probably the biggest complaint when it comes to the Adventures of Tom Sawyer is that it was released in the United States out of order. And that essentially when it came to the presentation of it, it was essentially an action adventure game. I want to make it very clear that as famously demonstrated with Donkey Kong Country, it has been apocryphally associated with one of the major designers of the game, but very faithful in terms of its message, that certain video games, including some of the most famous video games in history, actually have very simple mechanics to them. And some players are willing to overlook those simplicities if the game is fun to play, if it's visually pleasing, if it really showcases the audio or the visual potential of the system that they're using, or if they're even pioneering when it comes to, say, overcoming the limitations of sound, which was very true when it came to Donkey Kong Country's music on the Super Nintendo. And furthermore, when it comes to Square's Tom Sawyer, one of the richest aspects when it comes to JRPGs are stories, and not only stories, but even stories that have branching storylines. What we see over here is one of the most famous JRPGs in history, known as Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo. Some people consider this to be the greatest JRPG ever made. This character who you see over here is a former knight that has been turned into a frog. This story has over a dozen different endings, including endings that are based on the decisions your characters make, where they have to choose one route or another. And as a result of this, you can complete this game and even get a happy ending where that character is a frog. Or you can get a happy ending where that character actually regains his humanity. The problem is, one of the main villains in the game is never redeemed. And there's one last aspect that I personally find very enjoyable about JRPGs. You have the opportunity to change the names of the players, and the pre-programmed script within the game actually follows those changes. So in a way, if this were to say be based a little bit more heavily on the works of Sam Clemens, you could actually put your own twist on it. You could even write them. You could explore the possibilities and the what ifs that happened off the pages, or even change the story to your own liking. And finally, when it comes to the overall mapping of video games, both physically and mechanically, I have over here one of the most famous maps in video game history, specifically for Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo. When it comes to this large, enormous approach, when it comes to having a physically large world, the same mechanics exist when it comes to interactive storytelling. What you're seeing over here could easily be the branching pathways of a JRPG, but what you are actually seeing here is provided to me by the author. This is actually the blueprint that author Bart King used for his Choose Your Own Adventure that recently came out, Time Travel In. These same mechanics, which are used in storytelling, are easily transferable when it comes to their usage in video games. What I'm saying over here is that if you can imagine Tom Sawyer painting Aunt Polly's fence himself or not painting it, simply that decision, if you could picture him painting it himself, or if you can picture him not painting it yourself, any one of Mark Twain's books, primarily his most famous works, can easily be adapted in the interactive medium of video games. And lastly, when it comes to this interactive type of storytelling, is it considered art? To challenge what Roger Ebert was offering. What you are seeing right now is a video game from 1983. I want to repeat, this is from 1983. This was designed by Don Bluth, the famous animator who left Walt Disney with quite a few animators and basically released the series of films, among them An American Tail and The Secret of Nim, and the big one, The Land Before Time, which essentially brought Disney animation to its knees and ultimately, in the reprogramming of themselves, led to the Disney Renaissance of the late 80s and the early 1990s, one of the biggest turning points in the history of animation. And what you are seeing over here is essentially an interactive movie. It was a Laserdisc game that was released in arcades. This was a huge quarter guzzler. There were no other video games that had graphics this good, let alone this beautifully animated by one of the best animators of the late 20th century. And what you would do is you would essentially have the opportunity to press up, down, left or right, or to swing your sword. And if you chose the right direction at the right time, the story would continue. If you made the wrong move, the story would end and you would have to reset earlier in the stage. Again, this is simply an interactive movie, no different than an interactive story when it comes to the Choose Your Own Adventure games. And it's actually this aspect of interactive storytelling that I personally consider to be the biggest lost opportunity when it comes to Mark Twain Gamer. Mark Twain designed one of the greatest games I have ever come across as a writer and as someone who appreciates a good story that's different every single time that you hear it. This, I'm going to quickly turn it over to the museum. Can you please quickly explain what we are looking at? Hello?
Now I'm back.
All right,
Sorry.
thank you very much.
This is the mantelpiece of the library in the Mark Twain House. And this room was a room where the family would gather. And famously, there is a game that Sam Clemens would play with his daughters, in which he would have to use every item on the mantelpiece to create a story every night. And he would have to start with the cat on the in the rough and end with the portrait of Emmeline, and use every object in between there, never ever duplicating a story. And the girls were wonderful at catching him out and making him start all over again if he tried to duplicate himself. So it was like an improv lesson for himself. It was creative fun with the girls. And it's actually an education program that our ed team still uses. Erin's in the chat right now, so I know she'll enjoy this plug. But we, for kids in schools, you can play this game with them using things from our mantelpiece and other objects in our collection and ed kits. So it's a really fun game to play, and it's super creative.
All right, I have a quick question.
Yes.
First of all, do we have any record of any of the stories that he told?
I don't know, to be honest. Not anything like formally written down. I think there's bits and pieces of them in. I don't think so though. Like not start to finish, which is
I
a
want to
bummer.
make this very clear to those of you who are here. Thank you so much for that insight. For those of you who are here, if you're a fan of Mark Twain, this is the equivalent of the burning of the Library of Alexandria. All these fantastic children's stories, which were supposedly a riot, are all lost to history. And the closest we can do is just guess using these right here. I want to make this clear. I am offering this as a challenge to everyone who is here and also to the museum itself. When it comes to this storytelling mechanism, when it comes to this game, someone out there, preferably in the museum, since you own the building, patent this, put into a box, make it a video game. All right, I'll play the role of Sam Clemens here, or at the very least, one of the people who told Sam Clemens, you could make a fortune doing this. It would be a wonderful game, an excellent activity, and an interactive experience that will always be different. Please do it. This is Sam Clemens's biggest lost opportunity when it comes to gaming. And it all started with that darn cat.
Cat in the rough. Yep.
So with all that said, when it comes to this whole debate, what would you rather have, a great video game or Huckleberry Finn? All I want you to take from this conversation is to simply dare to ask, why not both? Well, that's our discussion on Mark Twain Gamer. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now.
Yeah. So I just closed your screen. Aaron, our educator, just said we've offered it for adults as an interactive event, and she could be persuaded to do it again. So stay tuned, at least for that part. So we have 2 questions already in the Q&A, and then we have the poll results that we can kind of go through. But the first question says, thank you for your great talk. Given that 2/3 of the respondents of that poll preferred a great video game to The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, does it suggest that we are further along towards a post-literate society, or does it more specifically suggest that Mark Twain does not speak to the upcoming generation? What is your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, what I could say as a researcher is that this was without a doubt a non-scientific poll. So it's more interesting in terms of its triviality and the circumstances behind it. Naturally, more exhaustive studies could be done if anyone does want to test this more scientifically. If anyone here is from UConn, listen, this could be your PhD thesis. Feel free to do that. I will say, though, just when it comes to my understanding of these types of online polls, most of the people who were replying to the polls were most likely just clicking on what's most familiar to them. And many of them who were basically coming across this poll by Roger Ebert, they probably were visiting Roger Ebert because they probably didn't even think a lot about him or know anything about him until they heard this guy saying that video games are not art. So that naturally, especially in our era of online vigilantism, is going to get a lot of people online to simply vote, yes, I'd rather have a video game just to prove him wrong, or simply because they themselves are passionate gamers and they would want a great video game. It's like, what would you rather have, a winning lottery ticket, or would you rather have War and Peace? Well, a lot of people haven't read War and Peace, and if you were to ask the general public on that, someone's like, wait a minute, how do I get this winning lottery ticket?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to be honest. I mean, Roger Ebert isn't here, and he's not able to offer his opinion. I personally view that poll as it was something where he was going to win no matter what, because he was going to have something that he could write an article on. So I personally feel that was the main impetus for it. But I will really credit the one commenter who I wasn't able to find his or her name, but that person who offered the counterpoint that Mark Twain was in fact someone who designed the game while he was working on Huck Finn. That anonymous commenter is, in my opinion, the reason why we're talking right now. And the fact that led to that poll and all the subsequent rediscovery and appreciation for the board game, that I probably say is the greatest thing that came out of this. And I would actually say that the gaming community and appreciation for Huck Finn has increased not only because of that, but in my opinion, many gamers who had never read Huckleberry Finn were at the very least exposed to it because it brought Huckleberry Finn to these websites and these forums that otherwise would not be talking about Mark Twain.
Awesome. I will say, based off of that, so one of the questions that I asked was, do you think video games are art, to our audience? We had 7 people vote yes, 1 person vote no, and 5 people vote sometimes. So we're right there kind of in the center of whether the audience thinks that they're art or not.
I mean, do they want my opinion on that? Or?
I know you and I talked during the tech run. I mean, all the animation that goes into it, the voiceovers, the music, like there's so many pieces to it. They're basically little films. And so, you know, if you think cinema's art, you kind of almost have to think that video games are art.
I mean, my opinion is almost every major criticism of whether or not video games are art, it really falls apart if you just look at the incredible catalog of video games that we have. One of the criticisms of video games is that they're interactive. And so for that reason, the player is playing a role that's going to be affecting it. Well, guess what? Pretty much every work of art is interactive. It requires a pair of eyes or a pair of ears or some sort of sensory participation from the audience. And not only that, the audience changes as time. We were not the people that Rodin was, making his sculptures for. We weren't the people that Leonardo da Vinci was making his paintings or that Michelangelo was painting his frescoes. So basically, if you're making the case that art is something that is entirely discriminatory to who its audience can be, well, that's just a very narrow-minded approach to how art belongs to culture. And you can even take more of a classical view of it. I mean, the poet Dante Alighieri, he viewed any kind of work as art because it's a creation by humanity.
Yeah.
And in his Inferno, he made the case, the philosophical case, that anything that we create is an imitation of God, because in his universe, God created humanity, created humanity, and that God actually thinks it kind of cute that people are making things. He's like, oh, isn't that nice? They're trying to be like their old man.
Right? It's like us saying, like, oh, that's beautiful, sweetie, to 5-year-olds when they hand you a
No, I definitely feel that video games are an art form. I mean, MoMA has, exhibitions of video games now. You can go to some of the best museums in the country and see special exhibits on video games, sometimes the fascinating art that went into them. You can hear expert symphonies playing video game music. And I think it's very clear that the whole idea that video games are not art is one that is increasingly being corrected, in my opinion, in the best of ways, which is by people sharing their love for this artwork, for this painting, for these designs that they're doing, and really this medium for an interactive storytelling. We did mention it before I spoke, that if you think about the dominant art forms in history, I think the case could be made that within the 21st century and the late 20th century, that due to their popularity, it's possible that video games have become the most dominant new art form since the invention of the motion picture.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Based on that, one of our questions is, what music is used in these 2 video games? And it was referring to the first 2 that you showed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know about
Yes,
music?
I don't have the names of the composers, but I can say that the music in the first 2 video games are pretty good. They're actually quite typical of what you would expect on the NES during the time period, in the sense that they're very atmospheric. They might have something more like a march to them in order to make the character move around, their way of encouraging them to move. You might have noticed I played a little bit of the music when he was on the river raft, how it was slower, and in some cases actually more closely resembles a waltz. This is very common for music during the Nintendo, the 8-bit era, because usually controls are sluggish during that time period. And most famously in the original Super Mario Brothers, the music sort of matches that sluggishness by being slower to sort of recreate audibly the motion and the exertion of rowing an oar. I will say though, Squaresoft has fielded some of the best video game scores in history, specifically with their Final Fantasy series. And also when it comes to Chrono Trigger and when it comes to Earthbound, some of the best scores ever written come from Square. I do not know who their composer was for the adventure, or for Square's Tom Sawyer, but if anybody researches that, I would not be surprised whatsoever if it was one of their most famous, and thus one of video games' most famous composers.
We don't have very much time left, so I want to let you know some of the results of the polls. So we did ask if anybody had ever played a Mark Twain themed video game at all, and all 11 votes were no. So nobody in our audience tonight that voted, at least, has played any of those games. As of Friday, when I get back to my office, I will have played the the CD-ROM that we have. So anybody, staff or volunteers, come to my office on Friday, we'll play. However, when I asked, would you play a video game, it's pretty much split between yes, no, and maybe. So I'm assuming that we just don't have some, people that just don't play games in our audience. So pretty things there. It does seem, though, in our chat that we have a couple people who are going to go in on a Twain-themed Monopoly together. So that'll be a great thing that comes out of that.
Can I just say it's heartbreaking that Mark Twain didn't live long enough to play and complain about Monopoly.
Right?
I mean, imagine if the author of The Gilded Age lived to play that game. He would have made his own version.
Yeah. Most people seem to agree with you that Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court would make the best one. We have 3 votes for Huckleberry Finn and 1 for Prince and the Pauper. None for Innocents Abroad, Tom Sawyer, or The Mysterious Stranger, and those are the only options I gave them. So, but that's interesting. And let's see, what else did I? Oh, and the last question that we posed to the audience was, do you think Mark Twain would have written video games if he lived? 10 votes for yes, 2 votes for no. So, pretty swayed to the yes. And I agree with you. I think that if somebody said, hey, you can make money, he would have done it, even if he enjoyed it or not. So
not only that, you have to imagine when in his life it would happen. I mean, if it was early in his career, I mean, he could have been a completely different person and his career could have been different. But if it's late into his career, if it's old Mark Twain, who's just like sitting down and smoking a cigar, if someone said, hey, I'm Mr. Clemens, if you just hold out your hand, we have this check for $50,000 for you to license your video game. He would probably have something very clever to say, like, is it only 1 check?
Right. So the last question that I see in the question is why the cat in the rough? I don't know if we have a reason for why. We do know that they owned it. The one in the library is actually a reproduction. The actual cat in the rough that they owned is lost. So if anybody has it, we would love to have it. But the one that we have is based on a photo of the house. So and things. So but I think that's all the questions we have. So any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience, other than the challenge that we need to create some video games and board games and all of that?
In addition to my thanks, I'll be honest. I mean, the main thing I wanted to do was to offer that challenge. I figured this is the best place to do it. According to what I heard, I'm the first person to ever speak on Mark Twain video games at your location. I am honored that it begins here, and I really hope that the museum and anyone who is following this, any game designers, any students, any professors, accept this challenge. Say that it began here. The trouble began.
At the trouble begins. It definitely is. So I will say to all of our audience, please join us next month on December 15th for our next Trouble Begins. I'll be sitting down with Hannah Farber to discuss her books on the underwriters of the United States. So we're going from video games to insurance. Couldn't be further apart, but it'll be a fascinating talk as well. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us. Thank you, Giacomo. This was fascinating and really entertaining, and we'll hope to have you at the Hartford home soon, and maybe back to discuss future games of Mark Twain.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a privilege and a pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for being here today.
All right. Good night, everyone.